So, have you ever wondered why common sense reforms just seem to hit an absolute brick wall completely regardless of who's actually in office? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating, highly detailed policy analysis memo. It objectively examines the institutional and structural dynamics of the modern Democratic Party. Now, right off the bat, it's super important to note that this memo frames its claims purely as an institutional analysis. We're not looking at a political attack or some electoral prediction here. Instead, we're objectively exploring the author's argument that certain structural features in our politics today actually mimic classical oligarchy. It's a deep, theoretical dive into the mechanics of political power, organization, and how massive institutions operate behind the scenes.
To really get a grip on this theory, we're going to break the memo down step by step. We'll start by defining classical oligarchy, then map out the coalition architecture, examine the showdown between concentrated and diffuse interests, look at real-world policy impacts, and finally, wrap up with the broader implications for governance. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. Defining classical oligarchy. According to the memo, this whole theory draws directly from classical political philosophy. We're talking Aristotle, Polybius, and American founders like James Madison. You see, Madison and the founders explicitly designed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties from the tyranny of powerful factions. But the memo argues that modern institutional elites have effectively bypassed those constitutional safeguards. So, in this classical sense, oligarchy isn't about, billionaires in top hats with cartoonish wealth. It's actually about organized minority factions whose structural advantages allow them to completely override majority preferences and individual rights. It is entirely about institutional power and sophisticated organization dominating the unorganized individual.
Think of it kind of like a permanent standing army going up against a local neighborhood watch. The author argues that this specific oligarchic power structure pops up when entrenched institutions maintain stable, unchanging membership and persistent day-to-day access to policymakers. Because they have this massive organizational capacity, they can literally mobilize resources at scale on a dime. It's an infrastructure of influence that runs 24/7. And the core argument of this memo is that the Democratic Party's coalition contains multiple actors that perfectly fit this description, effectively creating a structural oligarchy that operates entirely independently of whatever everyday voters might actually want.
Section 2. The Coalition Architecture.
Okay, imagine if you could negotiate your own salary with your boss, but you were also the primary funder of your boss's election campaign. That is exactly what the author calls the closed loop. The memo identifies public sector unions, like teachers' unions and municipal employee unions, as a core oligarchic mechanism. And here's how the cycle operates. Step 1. They negotiate contracts with elected officials. Step 2. They use their vast resources to help elect those exact same officials. And Step 3. They constantly lobby the agencies staffed by those officials. It creates this highly concentrated, self-sustaining loop that ends up dictating policy way beyond just basic labor conditions.
But hey, the memo is quick to point out that this framework extends way beyond just unions. The architecture relies on an entire ecosystem of entrenched actors. We're talking permanent urban bureaucracies. Think massive school districts or city permitting offices. It includes sprawling university systems packed with administrative guilds, plus large nonprofit complexes and foundation-funded policy shops. And what connects all these different groups? Well, they all possess permanent organizational structures, they rely heavily on taxpayer-funded budgetary expansions, and they wield massive lobbying capacity that ordinary citizens simply can't compete with on a random Tuesday afternoon.
Section 3. Concentrated versus diffused interests.
So, this brings us to the actual engine of the theory, economist Mancure Olson's logic of collective action. The memo points out that concentrated institutional interests organize effortlessly. They function like an impenetrable fortress because they have permanent structures and their livelihoods are quite literally on the line. In stark contrast, diffuse interests, everyday parents, taxpayers, or just individuals relying on their Bill of Rights protections, are scattered. Their individual stakes in any single policy are comparatively small, which makes organizing them a lot like herding cats. The memo argues the Democratic Party's coalition is disproportionately composed of those institutional actors, creating a severe structural asymmetry that works against the individual.
And this leads us to a pretty harsh mathematical reality of modern politics. As the memo bluntly states, the organized minority consistently outperforms the unorganized majority. It's not necessarily about some malicious intent, it's just a simple, unavoidable mismatch of organizational leverage. The institution almost always beats the individual. It's the sheer force of collective action, effectively overpowering the diffuse desires of the general public.
Section 4. Real-world policy impacts.
So, how does this actually play out in reality? The memo maps the dominance of these entrenched groups across several specific domains. In the regulatory space, permanent agencies easily shape licensing rules, while everyday applicants, whose rights to free enterprise are theoretically protected, just end up buried in complex paperwork. In criminal justice, corrections unions can seamlessly delay reform timelines. The memo notes that when diffuse constituencies, like criminal justice reform advocates, try to step up and assert their rights, they're frequently defeated by these institutional elites. And that defeat doesn't contradict the oligarchic structure. According to the author, it actually proves it.
But perhaps the most striking evidence for this whole dynamic, according to the memo, is found in education policy. It functions as the ultimate institutional oligarchy. Diffuse stakeholders, everyday parents and students, are structurally marginalized because they simply cannot match the entrenched organizational leverage of school district bureaucracies and teachers' unions. The closed loop operates so efficiently here that the individual preferences of families are almost entirely eclipsed by the priorities of the institution.
Because they operate completely inside that closed loop we discussed earlier, these concentrated interests hold the keys to the castle. They actively shape curriculum content, dictate teacher evaluation metrics, and steer massive budget allocations. If a lone parent wants to challenge a curriculum or a staffing decision, they face a staggering uphill battle against a fully funded administrative guild. The memo asserts that these systems are structurally designed to prioritize the institution's self-preservation and budget expansion over the individual needs and rights of the students.
Section 5. Implications for governance.
When you zoom out, this oligarchic structure produces highly predictable, almost inevitable outcomes across three distinct stages. Stage 1 is deep policy inertia. Institutional actors will aggressively resist any reforms that threaten their staffing or relevance. Once they're fully entrenched, we move to Stage 2, constant, unrelenting upward pressure on budgets, completely regardless of economic conditions or what the taxpayers actually prefer. And finally, Stage 3, regulatory accretion. Red tape and rules just steadily accumulate. And not necessarily to solve problems, mind you, but because the institutions themselves benefit from managing and expanding that administrative complexity.
Now, let's pause here and emphasize a really precise distinction from the memo. These marginalized parents, the biases toward endless staffing expansions, the memo argues this is not inherently about corruption. We aren't talking about illegal backroom deals or cartoon villains smoking cigars in dimly lit rooms. It is purely about structural incentives. It's playing out exactly as classical political theory and the founders themselves would have predicted when powerful factions are left unchecked and allowed to consolidate their leverage over the system.
So I'll leave you with this to ponder. Based on this structural analysis, do you recognize these closed loops happening in your own backyard? When you look at your local school board or your municipal permitting office, who really holds the cards? Is it the everyday citizens whose rights are enshrined in the Constitution, or the organized institutional elites? The framework we've explored today suggests that the power imbalances you might feel aren't just accidental. They are a fundamental feature of the system's architecture. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the structures around you.